Right, so let's move on to take a look at this posture. And that's obviously I suppose the most famous kind of Yiquan push, the double front push. Well, it wouldn't be a double rear push, would it? But the double front push, there's a few things to say about it, a few technical things to point out first of all that will make it a lot easier for you to understand it conceptually and also improve how you do it, particularly if you're having some problems. And I suppose the first thing to re-emphasise is that with any kind of push, even in push hands, never mind sparring or a fight, they're never quite like the template posture, and sometimes they can be very far from the template posture because it's chaotic. And I think particularly with a push, it's harder to judge the distancing, to get the distancing right, at least to get the effect that you want, because you're trying to affect an opponent's whole body very often, and that requires a little bit more, well, significantly more correctness in the way that you're positioned in your own structure, whereas just thumping them right on one spot in their face is a little bit easier, technically speaking. So it will often look uglier when you see it in actual practice. But remember that thing Wang Shanzhai says, that to people who don't understand what they're seeing, what's actually beautiful looks ugly, whereas many things that are ugly actually look beautiful. So Chinese martial arts in action, yeah, it can look ugly, but you've got to see the way the template posture is being explored in the real live context. Secondly, really important thing for this kind of double push hands posture is that for the off-the-spot template postures, there's a difference between brace farley and gap farley. With gap farley, for the template posture, you use scrape rooting, so your foot shifts forward like this. However, in the brace farley version, it doesn't. It remains static, and there's really solid reasons for this, and you can use this to help you understand some of the physics that we're talking about, some of the concepts that we're talking about, and why it's so important to understand these. It's very often not necessarily a particularly powerful movement. It's quite dependent on the position of the opponent, and that's why you see people who are kind of sucker pushed, if you like, with a fight starter double push, and they get knocked clean over because they're in an unbalanced position. So you want to maximise the kind of power you get out of the push, particularly as you're using both hands. So you're taking a risk, you're losing the opportunity to cover your head or parry a punch or something like that. So you're committing both hands to the strike. So you want to maximise power, and the structure itself is different. So the second thing to understand is that the double hand push is a rear hand dominant posture, or more accurately, it's close. Its primary context is close, and that changes between gap farley and brace farley, and that's something that we need to understand. But it's close and rear hand dominant, and you can test this yourself really easy. You can just try exactly the same posture, push with your rear hand on its own, and then push with your lead hand on its own, and you can feel it's the rear hand that's structurally interlinked very solidly into the overall structure. The really important thing then is what the front foot does, because the front foot is where it sets. So it's rooted dominant on the back foot like that, really locks it into the floor, but it's the front foot where you'll feel, for example, the whole weight of the structure push down onto the heel of the front foot, and that's very different when you do it with brace farley than when you do it with gap farley. I mean, it's not a fixed rule. You can try the difference yourself, and sometimes the foot does move when you do brace farley. These are only like ideal template postures, but you can have an experiment yourself and feel it and feel the difference. And also it depends a little bit just how small the gap is, how big the gap is, how much you're bracing. If you start hybriding it, then the foot moves a little bit and so on. But have a try and feel the difference yourself. Gap farley is like 80-85% close for this posture, and the remainder is sink. So and that sink's going to be felt particularly on the front leg, because your whole posture is going to move forward, so it's always going to sink a little bit, and you're going to use a scrape rooting, and it's going to be quite a light set, relatively speaking. The heel's going to hit the floor, and also that scrape rooting is going to get like just a little bit of extra volume onto the posture, and you're going to need also that extra length. So This is the main problem with this posture. Like, you're usually not close enough or in the right position to actually make it effective. You're either too close, which requires a much different kind of push, or you're too far away, in which case you've got to make up some space. So it's usually timed using this scrape rooting, and that just increases the power, it increases the range, but it doesn't massively put a load of weight on the lead foot. And if it did, you'd be stretching out quite far, so it makes it an even more precarious posture. So that's why you, generally speaking, you do the scrape rooting out and back again very fast. It sets very fast on the heel, and it needs to be light to be able to do that. Now that's a kind of compression set, but it's a very short, fast compression set, and it doesn't use too much sink onto the lead foot. However, when you use brace farley, the moment you take that weight, you can feel the weight push down onto the lead foot, so you can feel the lead leg compress. As soon as you take that weight on that lead leg, as soon as you create that, well, it's going to be a compression set when you move. As soon as you feel you're taking that weight, it's too heavy to do the scrape rooting, and it's dangerous. There's too much weight on it. So instead, the foot stays in place and the whole movement is articulated from the body. And that's the difference between the two, because that uses like maybe 60% close, 40% sink. And it's a shame sometimes to see people get this wrong, where they're trying to do it and they don't have this kind of conceptual knowledge, so they can't understand why they're not making it effective. But this is the reason, this is the science behind it. It's quite obvious, really. You can feel it naturally if you're engaged, but if you're not, then you're just left wondering what is it, and that's actually the reason. That's the science behind these differences. And that can also be a little bit confusing when you see people practicing on the air, because if someone's practicing on the air and you haven't got a very good eye, you can't necessarily tell whether they are practicing the posture for gap farley or brace farley. So you think, if they're doing it on the air, it always looks like gap farley. And if they're not doing the scrape rooting, you think, that must be how it's done for gap farley. But that's wrong. They're practicing for the brace farley version of it. In most cases, if they understand this anyway, they're practicing for the brace farley version of it, even if they're just practicing it on the air. And it's a different kind of posture anyway. That's why you see two very different ways of doing this posture. Brace farley is much more hunched and wavy. It has much more articulation in the body, whereas with the gap farley, you want it as fast as possible. You want to just shoot the arms out. Still hunches over, but you want it as fast as possible. Anyway, to begin practicing it, don't worry about pulling back the scrape rooting. You can do it just to the template posture, to the hip point, and hold it there. You can build it step by step, and you can just check your posture a little bit and feel your posture, and then build back into the scrape back rooting. Now then, there's various versions of this, but the next one that we need to understand is moving round the bag. So you move round at an angle, and this is really useful because you want to be able to push your opponent on their weakest axis, and they won't usually be square on. Well, they very often are, aren't they? Let's face it, in the fight starter push. But while you're actually sparring or whatever, you want to move round them and push along their weak axis. And you can see here immediately, just from the still image, that something's changed in how the posture is stacked. And what's happening is we're shifting dominance from rear hand to lead hand. And this is inevitable because that's the direction you're pushing in more. And you can see the way that it's stacked with the lead foot out still. So there's still that compression down on the lead foot. And you have to time the posture with the set for this to try and maximise the force, because as you shift to the lead hand, you start losing force. It's not as strong, just like a jab is not as strong as a cross. So you start losing a little bit of the force. Try and compensate a little bit with the set, which you've got to integrate into the step. So as the foot hits the floor with the step, that's the moment you make contact with the opponent or the punch bag. As for what the context is, well, you have a go and you tell me what you think the context is when you try it. But inevitably, you do lose some power with this shift more over to the lead hand. And even more so when you do it with brace farley, so it becomes significantly more lead hand dominant with brace farley. Like, you've got to really push with the brace farley, and I'll demonstrate that. And it does absolutely become a matter of strength. Yes, good structure, but if you haven't got the strength, no amount of good structure is going to allow you to push something really heavy with just your lead hand and have a realistic effect. Unless, of course, you're one of these charlatans who's, got these amazing powers to make people just hop back and so on. But just by some amazing coincidence, they can't do that on a bag because, bags don't have chi. And, that's not what it says in the Tao Te Ching, because everything's got chi, so I don't understand that. Anyway, are not all things ultimately, is not the universe ultimately made of chi? So, anyway. So you've just got to practice it. It's very much about timing. So this other really important concept of all these different elements have got to come together to time this well, to get the posture correct. So have a go. Just be careful and make sure you do that kind of flat seeking step as you move around. Look carefully at how the posture is stacked, but mostly it's just, as ever, just about practicing it, about feeling it, but using the information, the scientific information that you're being given. Although always remember, a bad movement is based on the laws of physics just as much as a good movement, and that's why you need theory.